They said dogs don't cry, but if you ever looked into the eyes of one on the edge of goodbye, you'd know some hearts speak louder than words. In this story, a battle-worn Pitbull, a man haunted by loss, and a town longing for hope come together in a moment no one could ever explain. A story where science stood still, and love rewrote the ending. As philosopher Blaise Pascal once said, "The heart has its reasons which reason knows nothing of." Stay with us. This isn't just a story about a dog. It's about a bond that brought a soul back from the edge. In the quiet town of Silver Creek, Oregon, nestled between misty pine forests and winding back roads, life moves slowly. The kind of town where everyone knows your name, where the diner still serves coffee for $1, and where a dog sitting in the passenger seat of a rusted pickup truck was more common than not. For Daniel Carter, this place wasn't just home, it was sanctuary. At 41 years old, he'd seen more than his fair share of chaos, heartbreak, and loss. And through it all, the one constant in his life had 4 legs, a heart full of loyalty, and a gaze that seemed to understand more than words ever could. Baxter was no ordinary dog, a muscular pit bull with a brindled coat and amber eyes that shimmered like sun through whiskey. He had once worn a 9 vest, worked alongside police, and saved Daniel's life during a raid that turned deadly. That night, when bullets flew in a meth lab standoff outside Portland, it was Baxter who lunged, teeth bared, taking the hit that should have ended Daniel's story, but instead, it bound them together in a way no training or leash ever could. After the shooting, Daniel retired from the force. The pain in his shoulder never fully faded, but it was the ghosts in his mind that weighed more heavily, the faces he couldn't save, the silence left by those he once called brothers. Then, just 2 years later, a late-night call shattered what was left of his world. His wife, Claire, had died in a car accident on Highway 49. No warnings, no goodbyes, just a voicemail she never got to hear. He withdrew after that, moved to Silver Creek, took a quiet job as a night security guard at the local elementary school. A man once defined by action, now defined by absence. But Baxter stayed through all of it. Every morning, like clockwork, Baxter would greet him with a soft huff, tail wagging slow and steady. The two would take the same morning walk through Hollow Pine Trail, Daniel's hands in his coat pockets, Baxter trotting just slightly ahead, always glancing back to make sure his partner was keeping up. They didn't need conversation. The silence between them was a comfort. At night, Daniel would sit on the porch with a thermos of black coffee, staring out at nothing, while Baxter rested his head on his feet. Later, as Daniel slipped into bed, Baxter would take his spot at the foot, curled in the same patch of worn quilt he'd claimed since the first week they arrived. But there had been darker moments, 2 ones Daniel never spoke of. Nights when the silence became too loud, when the weight of everything he'd lost pressed so hard on his chest he thought it might cave in. There was one night in particular he'd never forget. He'd written a letter, left it on the counter, loaded his service weapon, sat on the edge of the bed with shaking hands, and just as he reached for the gun, he heard the scratching. Baxter was pawing at the bedroom door, whining, persistent. Daniel ignored it at first. But then came the thud. Baxter had thrown his full weight against the door, again and again, until it cracked open. The dog didn't bark, didn't leap. He just walked over, placed his head in Daniel's lap, and stared. Daniel never picked up the gun again. "You don't talk," he once whispered, gently scratching behind Baxter's ears. "But somehow, you always know when I'm about to fall." Baxter wasn't just a dog. He was Daniel's shadow, his anchor, the heartbeat that kept him tethered to the world. People in town knew them as a pair. The kids at the school called him Officer Baxter, and many claimed he could sniff out trouble before it even started. Daniel never corrected them. It made the children feel safe, and in some quiet way, it made him feel needed. But more than safety, Baxter brought a kind of quiet dignity to Daniel's life. He was loyal without asking for praise, protective without being overbearing, and always present. On rainy afternoons, they'd sit by the fireplace, Baxter snoring softly while Daniel read through tattered books he'd been meaning to finish for years. On Sunday mornings, they'd drive to the lake and skip stones, Baxter occasionally leaping into the water with reckless joy, only to shake off the chill all over Daniel. Seconds later, those weren't just routines, they were lifelines, threads that stitched the days together, proof that even in the aftermath of loss, there could still be warmth, still be love. In a world that often moved too fast, Daniel had found a rhythm, and at the heart of it was a Pitbull who never let go, who never ran, who never gave up. What Daniel didn't know, what no one could have imagined, was that their rhythm was about to be shattered, that the creature who had saved his life more than once, who had stood as a wall between him and the dark, would soon need saving of his own, and that sometimes love doesn't just hold on, it fights back. It started on a Thursday morning in late October. The leaves outside Daniel's cabin had turned brittle shades of amber and red, blanketing the ground in a quiet mosaic that usually made Baxter's tail wag with delight. But that morning, something was different. The air felt heavier, like a storm approaching from somewhere unseen, and when Daniel called for Baxter, expecting the familiar jingle of tags and the thud of eager paws, the house remained silent. He found the Pitbull still curled on his bed, unmoving. At first, Daniel thought maybe Baxter was just tired. Maybe the cooler weather had settled into his joints. But as he stepped closer, concern began to tighten in his chest. Baxter's eyes, usually sharp and alert, were dull clouded. His breathing was shallow, his ribs rising and falling in stuttering rhythm. The bowl of water he'd filled the night before remained untouched. When Daniel knelt and whispered his name, Baxter tried to lift his head, but failed. His tail gave a weak twitch, but that was all. A panic rose in Daniel's throat, bitter and metallic. He scooped Baxter up as gently as he could, cradling the 80-pound dog against his chest like a child. The drive to the Silver Creek Veterinary Clinic felt longer than it ever had. Every red light, every slow-moving car, every bump in the road was torture. Baxter whimpered with each jolt, a soft, strangled sound that cut through Daniel's heart like glass. When they arrived, Dr. Evelyn Rhodes was already waiting. A woman in her late 40s with a calm demeanor and kind eyes. She'd known Baxter since the day Daniel brought him in to be retired from the 9 unit. She'd patched up his injuries, removed a few benign tumors over the years, and had a habit of slipping him peanut butter biscuits when Daniel wasn't looking. The moment she saw Baxter, her smile disappeared. They moved quickly blood tests, an ultrasound, vitals. Daniel sat in the corner, fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. He watched the way Dr. Rhodes's expression shifted, subtly tightening around the eyes, the downward pull at the corners of her mouth as she read the data on the screen. He had seen that look before, in hospital rooms, at accident sites, in the moment, right before someone gave news that would split your world in half. "Daniel," she said finally, motioning him into her office. Baxter remained in the treatment room, hooked up to in the fourth, his breathing now a rasp. "Dr. Rhodes folded her hands on the desk, her voice soft but unwavering. "The blood work shows signs of acute liver failure. His enzyme levels are off the charts. That explains the fatigue, the appetite loss, the weakness. But there's more." She turned the monitor toward him. The ultrasound revealed a mass near the pericardium. His heart, it's sizable. And given how quickly the symptoms came on, it's likely aggressive. "I'm afraid the prognosis isn't good." Daniel stared at the screen, trying to make sense of the gray smudges that meant nothing to him. "How long?" She hesitated, but not for long. "Days. Maybe less?" "He's very sick, Daniel." He didn't respond. Couldn't. Just days ago, Baxter had been bounding across the school playground, tail high, letting a group of second graders toss tennis balls he never bothered to fetch. Just days ago, Baxter had been fine, healthy, whole. "No," Daniel whispered, almost to himself. "This can't be real, I'm sorry," she said again. And this time, her voice cracked ever so slightly. "I know how much he means to you." But the words were hollow. Daniel's mind was spinning. Images flooded in Baxter, pulling him out of a burning shed, curling around Claire's feet every night before she died, sitting beside Daniel during every lonely Christmas, every thunderstorm, every sleepless night. He wasn't ready. Not for this. Not for goodbye. "He's not just a dog," Daniel said, his voice raw. "He's the last piece of my family. The last one who knows all of it, all the bad, all the good. He stayed when everyone else left. He never asked why I changed. He just stayed." The room was quiet. The only sound the soft hum of the machines down the hall. "Doctor." Rhodes reached across the desk and placed her hand on his. "We can manage his pain," she said gently. "Make him comfortable. But I need you to prepare yourself. This isn't something we can fix." Daniel didn't know what to say. The walls felt like they were closing in. Fear clawed at his chest. Not just grief, but terror. The kind that creeps in when you realize the one thing holding your world together is about to be taken. He left the office and returned to Baxter's side. The pit bull lay still, his breathing ragged, his eyes barely open. Daniel sat on the floor beside the metal table, stroking the patch of fur above his friend's brow. Baxter didn't react much, but his tail gave a single soft thump. "You're still in there?" Daniel whispered. "I see you." There was a knot in his throat that wouldn't budge, a storm brewing behind his eyes. "You don't get to leave me too," he murmured, forehead resting against Baxter's. "Not you. Anyone but you." In that moment, surrounded by sterile walls and fluorescent lights, Daniel Carter, the man who had faced armed criminals, pulled bodies from wreckage, and held the hand of the dying, felt helpless. Not because he didn't know what to do, but because he knew there was nothing left to be done. And somehow, that was the worst part. The garden behind Silver Creek Veterinary Clinic wasn't large, but it had been carefully cultivated to feel like a sanctuary. A cobbled path wound between flower beds and maple trees, leading to a small circle of stone benches and a fountain that murmured softly beneath a canopy of changing leaves. It was a place designed for last goodbyes, quiet, private, and peaceful. And now, Daniel Carter found himself walking that path with Baxter, cradled in his arms, wrapped in the old blue fleece blanket that had traveled with them on countless camping trips. The blanket was faded at the edges and smelled faintly of pine needles and smoke remnants of the fire they'd built during a snowstorm in Mount Hood. 7 years earlier, Baxter had insisted on sleeping under it. Even when the temperature dropped below freezing, that night, they'd huddled together beneath a tarp, listening to wind batter the trees, while Daniel read from a water-stained copy of Call of the Wild. It had been one of their first trips after Claire's death, a trip meant to start over, a trip that changed everything. Daniel laid the blanket down gently in the garden, smoothing out the creases with trembling hands. With the help of a veterinary assistant, they lowered Baxter onto the soft surface. The pit bull let out a low, tired sigh but didn't whimper. He was too far gone for that. His breathing was still shallow, his body still limp, but Daniel stayed close, his hand never leaving the warmth of Baxter's fur. He sat cross-legged beside him, running his fingers through the short brindled coat, watching the slow rise and fall of the dog's chest. And then the memories came rushing in like a tide. 7 years ago, a collapsed farmhouse, a blizzard howling through Silver Ridge. Daniel and Baxter had been called to assist in a search for a missing 5-year-old girl named Ellie. The conditions were brutal. Visibility was nearly zero. But Baxter wouldn't stop. He pulled at the leash. He barked at doorframes and snowdrifts. And finally, after hours of cold, desperate searching, he began to dig beneath a collapsed porch. They found her there half-conscious, clinging to life. Ellie survived. And a week later, Daniel received a handwritten letter from her mother. "If my daughter lives to see her next birthday," it read, "it's because your dog refused to give up. He's not just a hero, he's hope made flesh. If there's a next life, I hope she's protected again by someone like him, or maybe she'll grow up to be someone like him." Daniel had read that letter so many times the paper had grown thin at the folds. He'd kept it in a tin box on his nightstand, along with a lock of Claire's hair and a photo of Baxter as a puppy. Now, in the fading light of a dying day, he wished he could believe in another life, in a place where all good dogs waited. Dr. 1. Evelyn Rhodes approached slowly, the syringe in her hand trembling slightly. "We'll give him something to help him sleep first," she said gently. "Once he's calm and resting, you can tell me when you're ready." But Daniel barely heard her. His attention was fixed on Baxter, on those eyes that had seen so much, eyes that were still open, though dim. He leaned in close and whispered, his voice no louder than a prayer. "If you saved me once," he said, "maybe love can save you now." He pressed his forehead to Baxter's, lips brushing against the space between the dog's ears. "You always knew when I was about to fall apart. You always showed up. So, if there's anything left in you, if you've got even an ounce more fight, use it now. Please." The air around them seemed to still. Even the fountain quieted for a moment, and then something happened. Baxter moved. It wasn't a twitch. It wasn't a spasm. It was deliberate. With an audible effort, the Pitbull lifted his head and pushed it against Daniel's chest. Then, with trembling forelegs, he raised himself just enough to wrap them clumsily but unmistakably around Daniel's shoulders. It was a hug. Not a reflex. Not a last gasp. A hug. "Dr. 13. Rhodes gasped, dropping the syringe to the ground. Her assistant covered her mouth with both hands. Neither moved. Daniel froze. Then slowly, his arms closed around his friend. The blanket bunched beneath them as he cradled the dog's body, holding on like he might never get another chance. "You know I'm not ready," he choked out, tears streaking down his cheeks. "You always know." The hug lasted maybe 30 seconds. Maybe less. But to Daniel, it stretched into eternity, a defiance of nature, a final gesture of understanding from a creature who, by all logic, should not have had the strength. When Baxter finally let go, he sank back onto the blanket, chest heaving. His eyes fluttered closed, but there was peace in them now, a kind of quiet that Daniel hadn't seen all day. Dr. Rhodes knelt beside them, her own eyes glistening. "I've been doing this for over 20 years, she said softly, "and I've never seen anything like that. Not once." Daniel couldn't speak. He just looked down at the dog in his arms, the dog who had been his shield, his silence, his reason. In that moment, everything else faded. The machines, the diagnosis, the inevitability. Because sometimes a goodbye isn't the end. Sometimes it's the beginning of a miracle. For a long moment after the hug, no one in the garden room moved. The only sound was the soft rustling of the maple leaves above, whispering secrets no one could quite hear. Daniel remained still, cradling Baxter's head against his chest, his hands trembling as they stroked the worn patch of fur between the dog's ears. He wasn't sure what had just happened, whether it was real, whether grief had finally broken something inside him, but it didn't matter. That hug, brief and aching, had felt like the truest thing in the world. Dr. Evelyn Rhodes retrieved the sedative syringe. Hesitating again, she glanced at Baxter, at Daniel, then down at the dosage. "We don't have to rush," she said gently. "Let's give him a moment." Daniel nodded wordlessly, grateful for her patience. He leaned back slightly to get a better look at Baxter, whose breathing remained uneven but deeper, somehow more present. His chest no longer rose in jerky half-breaths, but in a rhythm Daniel hadn't seen since the day before all this began. Then, without warning, Baxter opened his eyes, not fluttered, not blinked, opened wide, clear, alert. Daniel froze. "Bax?" he whispered, not daring to believe it. Baxter blinked slowly, his gaze locking with Daniel's. Then, impossibly, he lifted his head again higher this time, not straining or trembling, but with purpose. He sniffed the air once, exhaled in a low huff, and shifted his weight so he could lie more comfortably on the blanket. It was the first voluntary movement he'd made in almost 2 days. "Doctor." Rhodes moved quickly now, her instincts pulling her back into her role as clinician, even as her heart threatened to leap out of her chest. She grabbed her stethoscope, knelt beside Baxter, and pressed it gently to his side. Silence. Then his heart rate is stabilizing, she murmured. Actually, it's strengthening. She looked up at Daniel, stunned. This doesn't make any sense. She ran through her routine, checking Baxter's pupils, gum color, response to touch. Everything was improving. Everything. Daniel couldn't speak. He just watched, afraid that if he blinked, the spell would break. His mind raced through every logical explanation, but nothing added up. Baxter had been minutes from death. He'd received enough sedative to relax a dog twice his size. And now, here he was watching, breathing, responding. Doctor. Rhodes stood slowly, her hands shaking. I've been practicing veterinary medicine for 18 years, she said, her voice low. I've treated hundreds of cases. I've watched animals fight, and I've watched them fade. But this, I've never seen anything like this. She sat back on her heels and let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Maybe we misdiagnosed the progression, she offered. Though her tone lacked conviction, maybe it's a rare reaction to the combination of meds. Or maybe. She didn't finish the sentence. Maybe it's something else, Daniel said softly, still staring at his dog. They stayed there for hours. Doctor. Rhodes canceled her remaining appointments. The garden room was cleared of visitors. Baxter, now covered with a warm towel, lay quietly between Daniel's knees, his breathing steady, his eyes following every sound, every movement. The fourth continued to run fluids into his system, and every half hour, another set of vitals was taken. Every time, the numbers came back stronger. Liver enzyme levels began to drop. Not dramatically, but enough to notice, enough to defy the earlier blood work. Dr. Rhodes, puzzled but methodical, rechecked the records. Everything from the day before had pointed to complete organ failure. Even the mass near his heart had appeared large and irregular. But now, on a portable ultrasound machine wheeled into the garden room, the image told a different story. The mass was still there, but it was smaller, measurably smaller. Its edges looked cleaner, more defined, less aggressive. Tumors don't shrink like this in a matter of hours, she whispered, half to herself, half to the universe. This doesn't happen. She sat with Daniel afterward, the garden now bathed in late afternoon sunlight. I don't want to give you false hope, she said carefully, but something is happening here that I can't explain, and I'm not the only one. I've already sent his labs to 2 colleagues, one at Oregon State, one in California. They both said the same thing. This level of turnaround this quickly is unheard of. Daniel nodded slowly, his hand still resting on Baxter's side. I don't need the science to make sense right now, he said. I just need time. Time I didn't think I'd get. That night, they moved Baxter from the garden room to a quiet recovery suite at the clinic. Dr. Rhodes gave Daniel special permission to stay with him overnight. A cot was set up in the corner, but Daniel never used it. He laid out the blue fleece blanket on the floor and settled in beside his dog. He couldn't sleep. Not really. He spent most of the night watching Baxter breathe, counting each inhale like a sacred promise. The rise and fall of his chest had become the most beautiful thing in the world. Every few hours, a vet tech would peek in, expecting to find a different story, but every time, Baxter was still there breathing, watching, healing. Daniel was overwhelmed, not just with gratitude, but with a fear he didn't dare speak out loud. What if this was temporary? What if it was only borrowed time? But deep down, beneath the worry, a seed of hope had taken root, because sometimes the impossible wasn't a word. It was a moment, and Daniel had just lived through one. By the next morning, the news had already begun to spread. What had started as a quiet, tear-streaked moment in a private garden behind a small-town veterinary clinic had rippled outward, reaching corners of Silver Creek that hadn't heard a hopeful story in quite some time. In a world increasingly filled with headlines that made people feel powerless, something about a dying Pitbull who hugged his owner and then refused to die stirred something deep in the hearts of everyone who heard about it. It began with a single photo. A vet tech named Laura had quietly snapped a picture during Baxter's embrace. a moment so raw and human, it had silenced everyone in the room. She hadn't meant to share it widely, but that night, she posted it to the clinic's Facebook page with a simple caption, "The hug that changed everything." Within hours, the photo had been shared over 1,000 times. By lunch, it had made the front page of the Silver Creek Gazette, under the headline, "The Hug That Changed the Ending." It wasn't long before the local radio station picked up the story, then regional news, and then, seemingly overnight, emails began flooding Dr. Rhodes's inbox, dozens from veterinary professionals across the country, many of them asking the same question, "Can we study the case?" Others wrote simply to say thank you for reminding them why they became vets in the first place. But while experts debated immune responses and spontaneous tumor regression, the people of Silver Creek didn't need a scientific explanation. They just knew what they felt: hope. At Baxter's side, Daniel remained quietly overwhelmed. He'd never been the center of attention, never wanted to be. But now his phone buzzed constantly. Messages poured in. Neighbors dropped by the clinic with treats, flowers, handwritten notes. Most he didn't answer. He didn't want to leave Baxter, not even for a minute. The Pitbull, while still weak, had become more alert each hour, his tail thumping softly whenever Daniel entered the room, his eyes following every word spoken around him. Then, on a golden Saturday afternoon, a knock came at the clinic door. Daniel opened it to find a girl standing there, small and shy, holding the hand of an older woman with silver hair pulled into a bun. The girl was 12, maybe 13. Her jacket was too big, her cheeks pink with nerves. She held a card in both hands. "Are you Mr. Carter?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded slowly. The older woman stepped forward. "This is Ellie," she said. "7 years ago, you and Baxter found her under a porch during that snowstorm." Daniel blinked. His throat tightened. Ellie offered the card with both hands. The front had a drawing of a dog with a gold halo. Inside, in slightly crooked handwriting, it read, "You were my angel. Now I want to be yours." Daniel crouched down, looking the girl in the eyes. "You remember him?" Ellie nodded. "I still sleep with the scarf he left behind. Mom said he wouldn't stop digging until he found me." The older woman wiped at her eyes. "She always wanted to come back, and thank you. When we heard, well, we thought now might be the time." Daniel opened the door wider. "Come in. He'd like to see you, inside." Ellie knelt carefully beside the blanket where Baxter lay. The dog's ears twitched. His eyes flicked toward the girl. Curious, she reached out, gently resting her hand on his paw. "Hi," she whispered. "It's me." "I never forgot you," Baxter slowly lifted his head just an inch, just enough. For the rest of the day, people came, not in a rush, not in a crowd, but one or two at a time. Parents with children who remembered Baxter from school, retired officers who had worked with Daniel back in his 9 days, a mail carrier who used to leave treats in Daniel's mailbox for the boss. One woman, the town librarian, brought a basket of books with dog-eared corners. "I used to see you and Baxter reading on the bench outside the post office," she said. "Figured he might like something familiar around." But perhaps the most touching delivery came in the form of envelopes, dozens of them, tied with a blue ribbon. The staff at Silver Creek Elementary had heard the story. Without prompting, every student had written a note to Baxter. Some were drawn in crayon. Others had glitter, stickers, or little smudges of chocolate fingerprints. Daniel opened one at random. It read, "Dear Officer Baxter, please don't go. Missed." Daniel would be so sad, and we would be too. Another simply said, "Dogs can't die if we still love them, right?" Daniel couldn't hold back the tears. Not when he saw the sheer outpouring of affection. Not when he realized that Baxter, his dog, his shadow, his silent strength, had become something more than just his. He belonged to everyone now, in a town that had long felt like it was fading quietly into obscurity. This old Pitbull had reminded people what it meant to believe again, to gather, to feel, to hope. Later that night, as Daniel sat beside Baxter's bed with the handwritten card from Ellie tucked gently into the dog's blanket, Dr. 79 Rhodes joined him, a mug of tea in her hand. "I've never seen anything like this," she admitted. "The recovery, the response from the town, it's like they're all holding on to the same thread." Daniel nodded. "He saved lives. Evelyn. Mine. Ellie's. Probably more we don't even know about. Maybe now. People are trying to save his." She sat beside him, quiet for a while. Then she said something he wouldn't forget. "Sometimes healing doesn't start in the body. It starts in the hearts around it." And as Daniel looked at the old dog sleeping peacefully beside him, tail twitching at the sound of children laughing outside the window, he realized one thing for certain. Whatever tomorrow held, Baxter wouldn't face it alone. The morning air on Hidden Pine Trail was crisp and filled with the faint scent of cedar and dew. The leaves overhead shimmered gold and copper in the autumn sun, and the path, though scattered with fallen branches and leaves, still held its familiar bends and clearings, every step a memory for Daniel. He hadn't walked this trail in years, not since Baxter first began slowing down, and certainly not since the day everything changed. But today was different. Today, Daniel wasn't walking the trail alone. To his left, Baxter padded along carefully. The Pitbull's gait was slower now, his body leaner, a slight limp in his left hind leg from old injuries and recent exhaustion, but he was alert, more alert than he had been in months. His nose twitched at every breeze, every scent the forest offered, and his eyes, though flecked with age, sparkled with quiet purpose. To Daniel's right walked a boy no older than 8, freckled, wide-eyed, and clutching a stick like it was a lightsaber. His name was Mason Daniel's grandson, and just a step behind them, trying not to cry, was Rebecca Daniel's daughter. He hadn't seen her in 7 years. Their last conversation had ended in anger. A phone call slammed shut on the words, "You loved that dog more than you ever loved me." And maybe at the time she wasn't entirely wrong, or maybe she just hadn't seen the whole picture. Back then, Daniel had been raw, broken in the wake of Claire's death, holding himself together with duct tape and routine. Baxter had been the only thing grounding him, the only living soul who didn't expect him to be okay. And in choosing silence and safety with his dog over confrontation and messy healing with his daughter, maybe he had failed her, maybe he had failed them both. But now she was here, back in Silver Creek, back on the trail. She had come after reading the article in the Gazette, after seeing the photo of Baxter hugging Daniel, and after hearing that somehow, against all odds, the dog she once blamed for tearing them apart had become a symbol of something greater. They had barely spoken when she arrived at the clinic a few days ago, Mason hiding behind her legs. There was just a look, 1,000 unspoken things in the space between them, and then Rebecca had crouched beside Baxter, slowly holding out her hand. Baxter, ever the diplomat, had placed his muzzle in her palm. Now, walking together in the woods, Daniel found himself stealing glances at his daughter, marveling at how much time had passed. Her hair was longer, her voice softer. There were tiny lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. And Mason, he was a spitting image of her at that age, curious, kind, full of stories. "You told me he was big," Mason said suddenly, looking up at Daniel. "But I didn't think he'd be this big." Daniel chuckled. "He used to be even bigger. Believe it or not, used to chase deer off this trail like he owned the mountain," Baxter huffed, as if amused by the memory, and Mason laughed, crouching to scratch behind his ears. "I always thought you were making it up," the boy admitted. "The stories, the ones about Baxter finding people in snowstorms and chasing bad guys, I thought maybe they were pretend they weren't," Daniel said. Not a word of it. There was silence for a while, the wind whispering through the trees. Birds called in the distance, and somewhere far below, the creek burbled over stones. Daniel let the peace of it soak in. He hadn't realized how much he missed this trail, this ritual, and he hadn't realized how much it had hurt. Not sharing it, Rebecca's voice broke through his thoughts. Quiet, but clear. "I was so mad at you," she said. "For a long time, I didn't understand. I thought you pushed us away after Mom died, because it was easier to just hide with Baxter. Daniel stopped walking, turned to face her. I did, he admitted. At least partly. I was scared. Everything felt like it was falling apart, and I didn't know how to be strong for you. Baxter didn't expect me to be strong. He just let me be broken, Rebecca nodded, tears in her eyes. Maybe I was wrong, she said. Maybe loving him wasn't choosing him over us. Maybe it was the only way you knew how to keep breathing. Daniel looked down at Baxter, who had paused, watching both of them with a gentle patience. His tail gave a slow, understanding wag. Rebecca stepped closer, wiping her cheeks. You know, she whispered, her hand brushing Mason's shoulder. When he was little, I used to tell him bedtime stories about a brave dog named Baxter. I told him the same stories you once told me. He never believed they were real until he saw the photo. Daniel swallowed hard, his chest tightening. Thank you for bringing him, he said softly, looking down at Mason. Rebecca shook her head. Thank you for not giving up. On him. On us. The three of them stood there for a moment, framed by the golden leaves and the long shadows of late morning. Baxter took a few steps forward, then looked back, waiting. And, for the first time in over 7 years, the Carter family walked that trail together. 3 generations, 2 healing hearts, and 1 miracle dog leading the way. As they reached the summit clearing, the sun broke through the trees in warm beams. Mason dropped to his knees beside Baxter, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck. I think he's more than a hero, he said. I think he's magic. Daniel knelt beside them, his hand resting on his grandson's shoulder. No, he said, voice steady and full. He's love? That's what he is. Pure, simple love. Rebecca joined them, and for the first time in a long, long time, Daniel felt whole again, not just because Baxter had survived, but because somehow, in the wake of that survival, they all had. The wind on Eagle's Crest carried the scent of wild thyme and pine needles, curling through the late spring air like a gentle memory. The sky stretched wide and open above, painted in soft blues and silvers, with clouds trailing like brushstrokes. It was quiet, the kind of sacred stillness that only came at the top of the world, or perhaps at the end of a long journey. Daniel stood at the edge of the overlook, his boots planted in the familiar soil of a trail he hadn't walked in years. Until recently, to his right stood Mason, his 8-year-old grandson, holding a smooth rock he'd picked up along the way, and between them, moving with the slow, dignified grace of someone who had earned each and every one of his gray hairs, was Baxter. The old Pitbull was clearly aging. His once powerful stride had mellowed into a steady shuffle. His muzzle, once streaked with just a hint of white, was now fully silver. His breathing was deeper, more deliberate, and he paused every now and then to rest. But even so, his ears perked with every bird call, his nose twitched at every breeze, and his eyes, those eyes, still held that impossible light. It had been 6 months since that impossible day in the garden room. 6 months since Baxter's body had begun to do things no vet could explain, since his blood work turned from hopeless to hopeful, and since a town rediscovered what it meant to believe. Dr. Rhodes had documented every test, every update, every baffling scan. Veterinary schools had contacted her for records. Conferences requested case studies, and yet, even as science tried to understand what had happened, Daniel didn't look for answers anymore, because the answer had always been right in front of him. Love. The kind that didn't need to be spoken to be heard. The kind that existed in shared silences and wordless comfort. The kind that reached through loss, through fear, through the end itself and pulled something back. Daniel reached down, resting his weathered hand on Baxter's head, the same way he had the first time they'd met, years ago on this very hill. Back then, Baxter had been a wriggling pup fresh from the 9 Academy, all energy and curiosity. Daniel had just lost his partner in the line of duty, and wasn't sure he was ready for another, but Baxter hadn't given him a choice. He had climbed into the passenger seat of Daniel's truck and refused to leave. That's where it all began. Now, all these years later, they stood in the same place, older, quieter, but not broken. If anyone ever asks whether dogs have souls, Daniel said quietly, gazing out at the vast horizon, I'll tell them about you, Mason. Still gripping the rock, looked up at his grandfather. What do you mean? Daniel crouched beside him. I mean, some people think only humans can feel things like hope, or faith, or love that's bigger than fear, but that's not true. This dog has taught me more about being human than most people ever have. Mason looked down at Baxter, who was now lying in the grass, his chest rising gently, his gaze watching the two of them with the calm focus of someone who had seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. Will he be okay? Mason asked. Daniel smiled softly. He's okay now. Every day we get is a gift, not a guarantee. But look at him. He's here. He's tired, sure, but he's still choosing to be here. And I think that's something worth being grateful for. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the mountains, casting the sky in golds and oranges. The trees below swayed in rhythm with the wind, and the world felt suspended like everything was holding its breath just a moment longer. Daniel stood again, offering Mason his hand. The boy took it, and together they turned toward the trailhead, ready to make the slow walk back down. Baxter rose too, joints creaking softly, but his tail giving a steady wag as he fell into step beside them. The three of them walked in silence. No words were needed. Not now, because some stories don't need endings. Some simply continue quietly, faithfully day by day. And as they disappeared down the trail, bathed in the amber glow of fading sunlight, it no longer mattered whether what had happened to Baxter was a miracle or a mystery of biology. What mattered was that a hug had changed everything. That love, when it is deep enough, powerful enough, unwavering enough, can call something back from the edge. And sometimes, that love writes its own chapter, one that science will never fully understand, but the heart always will. As the sun set on Eagle's crest, one truth lingered. Love may not always prevent loss, but sometimes it breathes life into what the world has already let go. Baxter's story isn't just a miracle. It's a reminder that in every heartbeat, in every gentle touch, there lies the power to heal. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps this channel reach 1,000 subscribers, fueling the creation of more heartfelt, meaningful stories. This video carries a lesson worth remembering. Now we ask you, have you ever witnessed a moment that defied logic but made perfect sense to the heart? Share it with us in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation alive.